Coming to you from the shores of gorgeous Lake Michigan, this is home to passionate book lovers everywhere. Hosting more than 260 acclaimed authors in 14 years, including best-selling novelists Geraldine Brooks, Ann Patchett, and Mitch Albom. We're live at the historic City Opera House in downtown Traverse City, Michigan. Welcome to the National Writers Series. Tonight, a conversation with Don Winslow, an international New York Times bestseller and former private investigator, presenting his new novel, City in Ruins, with guest host Doug Stanton, also a New York Times bestselling author and an NWS co-founder. The National Writers Series couldn't do this without our amazing audience, dedicated volunteers, and talented authors.
I love NWS!
A special thanks to our ongoing sponsors, the Green Brick Foundation, Northgard Technology, Traverse City Tourism, West Shore Bank, Northwest Michigan Arts and Culture Network, and our literary sponsor, Bay Books. And now, NWS Executive Director and co-founder Ann Stanton will introduce tonight's event with NWS Board President Clark Bunting, who is also the former president and CEO of the Discovery Channel.
We're excited to host international best-selling author Don Winslow, who will talk about his new book, perhaps his last book, City in Ruins, with guest host Doug Stanton. I'd first like to acknowledge that tonight's event is taking place on lands cherished for generations by the indigenous people of this area. We wish to recognize the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians in their land, which we are gathered upon today. It's now my honor to introduce Don Winslow. He writes novels whose music stays with you and whose action surprises and it sometimes shocks. He aims for the heart as his characters struggle to overcome their flaws and outrun their fate. Watching them do so is the literary pleasure of reading a Don Winslow novel. After publishing his first novels, Don branched into television and film with his friend Shane Salerno. Together they wrote UC Undercover and collaborated on the screenplay of his novel Savages, made into a feature film by Oliver Stone. Don has written a total of 26 novels, many destined for the screen, including the Danny Ryan trilogy. Don lives in San Diego County, California, with his wife of 39 years.
Good evening, folks. My name is Clark Bunting, and I'll try not to touch that mic. You'll be disappointed to know I am not Doug Stanton, but that will not last long. We're going to bring Doug out here momentarily. He is our guest host this evening, and he is also a #1 New York Times bestselling author of In Harm's Way, The Odyssey of Echo Company, and 12 Strong, which was made into a major feature film. Doug is the recipient of the 2021 Stephen E. Ambrose Oral History Award. Past recipients are pretty impressive. So a couple of the other folks who won, Steven Spielberg, you might have heard of Ken Burns, so it's a good company to be in. He founded NWS 14 years ago, along with Ann, and as well as Grant Parsons. And in 2018, Doug was named a Michiganian of the Year by the Detroit News. Now, we have a special show this evening. Before we bring Doug and Don onto the stage, we'd like to introduce you to Susan Odgers. She's the 2024 recipient of the annual William Montgomery Literary Service Award. Susan is an activist, a college instructor, a guest host for NWS, and a writer. For 16 years, Susan has written Adapted in TC, a Record Eagle column about those with disability or disease and their need to be treated with fairness and respect. You can also read her blog about her battle against breast cancer, and the frustrating healthcare system that sometimes fails patients and even bankrupts folks. Thank you, Susan, for being here this evening, and congratulations. Would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Good evening, everyone. I'm not sure how many of you know that Bill Montgomery was also a writer. This is his memoir, so you can find this lots of places, and it was really important for me to tell you about him as a writer. I'd like to thank the board of NWS for this award. Bill Montgomery was my dear friend, and he and his wife, Ann, are generous, lovely people. Ann is here tonight. I'd like to quote from Bill's memoir, Prayer for Time. I need to make clear how I want my life to bear witness among my surviving family and friends. I think tonight's award, Bill, is one of those many ways you're doing that. I met Bill through a colleague at NMC, John Paul, who had been one of Bill's writing instructors. Long before I was diagnosed with breast cancer, Bill was responding to advanced prostate cancer. Some of our best conversations revolved around the topic of hope. I am particularly touched to receive the award associated with Bill. Literary and service. What a wonderful pairing. Ann has asked me to say a few words about one example of community involvement and writing. A while ago, I wrote a Record Eagle column about the power of neighbors. In 1 year, my neighbors experienced suicide, divorce, foreclosure, domestic violence and arrest, unemployment, death, and serious health issues. It was quite a year. My family was overwhelmed as to how to help our neighbors. A group of us decided to talk to the neighbors and learn what these folks needed. Then small groups of neighbors took on those needs. People who had lived near one another for decades without much contact became closer. That column was well received and led to me performing a 2017 TEDx talk here in Traverse City and teaching other neighborhoods how to do what we did. Here's another example of the power of writing, a little more personal. I've been with my husband for 44 years, married 42. As a university senior, I went to a touring Broadway play at a Nederlander theater in Metro Detroit with a friend. During the evening, there were some issues with our seats, access, and so on. The staff solved every one of our concerns. Days later, as Miss Wheelchair Michigan, I wrote the theater a thank you for their care of persons with disabilities, highlighting the leadership of the house manager. Soon I received a call back. It was that house manager who, because of my letter, had received recognition from his boss. My letterhead had my phone number at the top. The manager never thought he'd see me again. Instead, he became my husband. And we all know at the height of the pandemic, the public looked to the poets and writers to make sense of what was going on. In accepting this award, I ask what you will do with writing as a means of community building. Will you volunteer? Will you create something? Maybe write a check? Thank you again for the Bill Montgomery Literary Service Award. I am so grateful and honored. Please welcome to the stage Doug Stanton and Don Winslow.
Thank you, Susan. You here. Everyone, thank you, Susan. That was really touching, and it goes right to the heart of the Bill Montgomery Literary Service Award, and not a better recipient. And thank you for listening to that, Don Winslow.
I loved listening to that. Thank you.
I feel that your work of a lifetime, which this novel, City in Ruins, is the capstone of, is in some ways also in service of telling a story of what it's like to be alive in America right now in the figure of Danny Ryan.
Well, thank you.
Could you
Thank
tell
much.
us who Danny Ryan is and what City in Ruins is about as we get started?
Yeah, sure. When we meet Danny Ryan, he's a longshoreman, fisherman, minor player in the Rhode Island Irish mob. He marries into it. He's the son-in-law. He loses this gang war. He flees across the country and spends decades as a fugitive, and when we meet him in this book, he is a multi-millionaire casino mogul. I should say that Danny is, in fact, all three books are modeled on Greek and Roman classics. So Danny is the figure of Aeneas in
Tell us
modern terms.
who is Aeneas and why did you do this?
Yeah, Aeneas is a minor player in Homer's Iliad. I grew up in the era of the New England crime wars, and when I first read the Iliad, rather later in life probably than I should have done, it reminded me not only of my beloved crime fiction genre, but also of real-life crime history. When I was a kid, there was an incident on the beach in New England that sort of reminded one of Helen of Troy. It launched a 10-year crime war that cost 44 lives. So when I read the Iliad, I went, I already know this story.
So tell us what the Helen of Troy story is if we don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, Helen of Troy was married to Paris, a Greek, and she ran off or was kidnapped, depending on your point of view, by Paris, a Trojan prince, and it launched the war of which, Homer wrote about and Odysseus fought in, and is the major part, really, of Greek literature. Aeneas, a minor player in that, sort of an outsider, and I liked that, Doug, because, he was inside the action, but mentally a little bit out of it, so you could have this character that could be doing the action, but also sort of commenting on it as an outsider.
What do you like about outsiders?
I think that for a crime writer of the sort of realistic, if you will, gritty kind of stuff that I usually do, it exists on the outside. It exists on the fringe of things, what Mr. Springsteen would call the darkness on the edge of town. That's where we kind of live. That's where I kind of grew up, or didn't, depending on your point of view. And so I like that outsider's perspective.
You grew up, your father was a sailor.
Yes.
And mother a librarian.
Yes.
Talk a moment about playing pond hockey with the kids, the local kids, and being part of the New England, not being part of it, but growing up during the New England Mafia war.
Yeah.
It was a blue-collar upbringing.
Yeah, blue-collar upbringing or a khaki-collar upbringing. My dad was a career NCO in the Navy.
Oh, he was in the U.S. Navy?
Oh, yeah. My dad was a Marine, a Navy medic on Guadalcanal at age 18.
He was?
Really was. Never really talked much about that. Got out of the war, and according to people who knew him then, he said that he wanted to do three things. He wanted to float around on the water, he wanted to read books, and he wanted to go to every zoo in Europe.
Which did he do?
All of them. And but it was so great. I've said this before. My dad was a sailor who loved books. My mom was a librarian who loved a sailor.
Wow.
And there were always books around our house.
How much did his being in Guadalcanal in the war affect him? Did you understand what he had been through?
Yeah, not until much later in life. Not until I read James Jones, The Thin Red Line. One of the great, I think, underrated American novelists.
He had a hand in introducing you to certain writers, like the landmark adventure book series.
Yeah.
I think you've mentioned, You Are There.
Oh, I love those books.
And also James Michener. What was your relationship like with your father? Was it close, distant?
It was close. We bonded over ice hockey. My dad was an extreme ice hockey fan. There was a minor league hockey club in Providence, Rhode Island, where the area I grew up in, North Main Street, this old hockey rink that didn't have plexiglass, it had chicken wire. And people used to reach through the chicken wire and grab opposing players. And I saw a Providence crowd actually boo Snow White one night. They were promoting the ice capades between periods, and Snow White and the dwarfs, and they were all skating around, and Snow White tripped and broke her ankle. And as they're taking her out on a stretcher, the Providence crowd is booing her, and going, "Learn to skate, you stink," you know. It was...
It's a good thing the Seven Dwarfs weren't there, because
man. Jimmy Breslin once famously said, the great Jimmy Breslin, that Providence, Rhode Island had the best thieves in the world because it was a factory town without a history of overpaying its employees. It's pretty true.
So this is where you grew up?
That's where I grew up, yeah.
When you were, 11, 12, I think, if I remember correctly, you had dinner once in a restaurant, and the next day someone got killed there.
2 hours later, someone got killed.
2 hours later.
2 guys got killed there. Yeah, during the wars that I alluded to. Yeah, it's a neighborhood called Federal Hill in Providence. Angelo's restaurant just this weekend celebrated its 100th year in business.
Oh, I was going to say its 100th murder, but
no.
Okay, well, 100 years.
Yeah, I left there, and a couple hours later, 2 brothers were gunned down sitting there.
How much did this growing up in this milieu affect your interest in crime? I mean, were you looking at noir? Were you reading crime fiction?
No, not until much later. I was reading the You Were There landmark series. You know, boy and girl, and they're there at something, and, you were there with them. I love those things. No, I was in my 20s before I started to read crime fiction. Yeah, I was working as a PI, private investigator, a job designation known as a street rat. In those days in Times Square in Hell's Kitchen. And I started to pick up crime fiction and just fell in love with it.
This is in the late 70s?
Late 70s, early 80s.
When Times Square was really dangerous.
Bad place, before Mickey Mouse arrived.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was cracked. You'd walk on the street and it felt like seashells under your feet, but it was crack vials.
Yeah.
And there was one guy, I laugh about it now, who used to go up on top of the buildings and launch cinder blocks off into the alley. So when you went into the alley after somebody, you always walked up against the wall, so the trajectory of the cinder block, would miss you.
And this is a place you thought you really wanted to go to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no.
It's interesting how you left home at 17, right?
Yeah.
And you moved to New York.
Moved to Nebraska first. College
in
Nebraska. Yeah.
Oh, college.
College.
What did you study in Nebraska?
I know it's hard to believe, but I did go to college. I even graduated, Doug.
With a degree in?
With a degree in African history.
In Nebraska?
In Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
There were 2 African history majors, both of us white guys, one from a little farm in Nebraska, who's now probably East Africa's best safari guide for many years now, and me, yeah.
And where did you go after you left with your degree?
New York.
Okay, and that's when you became a street rat.
Right, because I was going to become a writer, but we all know how that goes,
Okay, what encouraged you to be a writer, coming out of Providence, coming out of your hometown, and what was it that said?
Always wanted to do it. Okay. Always wanted to tell stories. My dad was one of the great raconteurs of all time.
Okay.
And he'd get together with his Navy buddies, and they'd sit around the dining room table, and I would get under the table, and they'd pretend to think I wasn't there. So I physically sat at the feet of some of the great storytellers of all time. Yeah. And listened to these guys tell these amazing stories about their adventures. And I always thought, since I was a little kid, that if life worked out the way I wanted it to, that's what I'd do for a living.
Was your mom in the room when they were talking at all?
Sometimes, and sometimes she'd go to bed, but because it would get late.
She was a librarian.
She was a librarian, yeah.
Did she push books your way?
Oh, yeah. The great thing, among many great things about my parents was, and it's funny, there are two siblings. I have an older sister, also a professional novelist. So 2 kids in the family, both published authors. My sister Christine Rollifson published, I think, 42 romance novels.
Really?
Yeah, very successful career. But we were allowed to read anything we wanted at any age. There was no censorship. There was no, that's too old for you, da-da-da. And I think that had a big effect.
Do you remember the thing you read that was the most eye-opening?
I read Guadalcanal Diary by Richard Tregaskis, and then later I read Leon Uris's Mila 18.
Don't know it, no.
About the uprising in the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw during World War II, was very eye-opening to me and a bit shocking. A book called Something of Value by Robert Rourke about Kenya, which is one thing that inspired me to want to go to Africa.
So you leave Nebraska with your degree and you eventually end up in Africa as a safari guide.
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was supposed to go into the State Department as an expert on African military affairs, which is what my education's in. If you all want your nap now, I am a specialist in the use of indigenous troops in counterinsurgency warfare. Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.
Have you read The Accidental Gorilla?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I went to college, Doug. So.
No, I know that. I know.
No. But I did that for a little bit, and I didn't like it. And so the other graduate at Nebraska had started this very cheapo safari company, and he needed a number 2, and I spoke the languages, and by that time I had the bush skills.
Wow.
And so I threw away the State Department career because it had benefits and insurance and a future, to become a safari bum, which is what I was.
So you lived in the bush?
Yeah. In a tent.
In a tent?
Yeah,
Did
but
you
in
ever,
the bush. Yeah.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and then I got engaged. My wife, of still, 39 years later this month, we had been dating, and then I left for the safari season. So I was gone for several months, and she came over. The first night, she's in Africa, right? Never left the country before. She flies to Nairobi. I have a very elderly African man pick her up, a guy that I would and did trust with my life. And we're in a tent, and 5 enraged female elephants stampede through the camp that night, right?
Yeah.
Highly lethal situation. And there's 10 minutes of just chaos and terror. And I figure, well, there's that relationship. That's over. And I'm looking at her, and her eyes are like saucers. And she looks at me and says, "That was so cool."
You knew right then.
Marry me, baby.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What's been her role in your creation as an artist?
A lot. We were laughing the other night, because some people now who don't really know us will sort of snarkily say, it happened at a dinner party last summer, that she married me for my money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They weren't there when we were pawning our, belongings to buy spaghetti and rice.
Did you really do that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she actually sold blood at one point. I came back from China because I was leading.
She's like, those damn elephants.
Right, exactly. What did I get myself into? No, she's been amazingly supportive, because I've had a career that's been up and down, and with a lot of downs. You know how this all goes. I was a overnight success in my 50s. That's a long night,
It's a long night.
That's an Arctic night.
you're married and you moved to LA and you're working as a trial consultant,
Yes.
right? Living in hotels.
Living in hotels.
And tell us what you're doing at night when you're not working as a trial. You're working on a novel, aren't you? Or-
Yeah, I was writing. I was trying to cobble together a living, right? I have a wife and then slightly later a baby, a toddler. And so I'm doing a number of things. You know, I'm doing trial consulting and investigative work in California. Then in the summers, we would move first to England, where I was directing Shakespeare plays at Oxford.
As one does.
As one does.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I told them I could direct Shakespeare plays, and then at night I would be like reading books about how to direct Shakespeare plays for the next day's rehearsals. And then we'd go to Africa and do safaris. And in Africa, I finally decided I better get serious about this writing thing. So I was trying to write 5 pages a day, no matter what. So yeah, when I was doing the investigative and consulting work in California, in my off hours, I'd be trying to get those 5 pages done.
When you were 11 or 12, you ran away from home and joined the theater?
Yeah.
For a day or two?
No, for a summer.
For a summer?
Yeah. Well,
What happened? Because I'm thinking about Oxford.
Yeah.
And your attraction to the theater.
That's how I got the Oxford gig. I got into an argument with my parents. And so I thought, you know, like, as one does, I ran away. And there was
what were you arguing about, you know?
No, I don't remember.
How old were you?
12.
12.
And there was a summer theater, still is, Matunic Theater by the Sea, you can look it up, about a mile from the house. And I was walking down that road, and they were holding auditions for people my age, and they had coffee and donuts, and it was raining. And I thought, coffee and donuts, I'm cold and wet, I can go in this theater and spend an hour or two and try to figure out, now what? But eventually I had to audition, and I got this part. And they asked me where my agent was. I had never seen a play, Doug, to that point, never mind been in one, and I thought they were talking about 007 or Man from U.N.C.L.E., like secret agents. So and then they said, well, where are your parents? And I said, well, I know where they are, but the reverse isn't true, you know. So they called my folks, and they said, you know, can we have your kid for the summer? And they quite keenly said, yeah. Take the little bastard.
But you lived at home.
Huh? I did. I went back and lived at home. Well, I lived at home part of the time. I lived at the theater part of the time.
Really? Lived at the theater?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The actors, when they wanted to party, which was all the time they weren't on stage, would lock me, seriously, they'd put me in the dressing room with a copy of Oliver Twist and say, read, we'll come get you when, everything's over. And that's how I discovered Dickens.
Where would you sleep?
There was an inn, a tavern that went with the theater, and it had a restaurant in the bottom and then rooms upstairs, and I'd sleep upstairs.
And you're 12?
Yeah.
That sounds like a dream, like Huck Finn or something.
Listen, man, they wanted me to see a play before I was in one, right?
Yeah.
So they put me in the wings of the play that was running before our play. I'm like, right over there. And I'm sitting there on this metal folding chair, I'm 12, and this actress comes off the stage and strips to her underwear to change her costume right in front of me. And I thought, I'm never leaving.
Wow.
Yeah. Heady stuff for a 12-year-old. Oxford.
How do you get to Oxford and direct a play?
I directed a theater company in college. I started a theater company that did plays just about history, and I got a grant from the Ford Foundation to do that.
Wow.
So I was directing usually 5 or 6 plays, productions a year. And that was my stipend that put me through college.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, so I did, and I did one Shakespeare play during that time. So I was in it doing the Africa gig, and the guy I was working with knew some people who were starting this academic program for high school students at Oxford in the summers. And their theater teacher quit at the last minute. And they said, do you want to go to Oxford and direct Shakespeare plays for kids? And I said, no. Of course I don't. I just hanging around Kenya chasing leopards with a camera, I love this job. But they talked me into it. And I found myself calling my then newlywed wife saying, hey, babe, before we go to Africa this year, what would you think if we spent, 5 or 6 weeks in England? So we did. And that turned into a 20-year gig.
No, really?
Yeah. I spent, 10 summers directing full-time and then 10 summers later as a guest lecturer.
And you're writing novels while you're doing this?
Yeah, trying.
I think, you published, 7 novels, and then you found, quote, success then?
Temporarily, yeah.
What book is that?
The Death and Life of Bobby Z.
Bobby Z.
Sold to the movies on a Friday and to Knopf on a Monday for kind of $bucks up.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember where you were when you said, I'm now going to write? Was it way before that, or was it?
Way before that. Yes, I remember it distinctly. It was about 4:30 in the morning in Kenya, in front of a fire, because the guides would get up very early to get everything ready for the clients by about dawn. You'd wanted the coffee and stuff ready, or a lot of times you'd go out scouting before. So I was sitting around the fire with, African guys that I worked with, and I had a malaria relapse and amoebic dysentery. Yeah, thank you. And I weighed 96 pounds. And I was, shaking because it's cold in the morning. Kenya's right on the equator, and it's the altitude of Denver, Colorado. And I thought, I'd better get serious about this. And I had heard Joseph Wambaugh, the great Joe Wambaugh, say that when he was an LA murder cop, he decided to write 10 pages a day. And I thought, I can't do 10, that's not doable, but I can do 5. And so I, later that day when I had a break from the clients, and I went back in the tent and started writing.
How old were you? Do you remember?
31.
Were you writing on a typewriter or a pencil?
No.
Did you have any idea what you were going to write?
No.
You have a unique way of avoiding writer's block or believing it doesn't exist, which is what?
I'll write anything. Writer's block is trying to write perfectly on the first draft, and you can't do that. And so I'll just move on to the next book or the next scene. I call it island hopping. Do you know what I mean? If this island's too tough to take right now, go to the next one and surround it, and then come back to it.
Son of a Guadalcanal.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I literally took that strategy from the Pacific strategy. Why should we take that island? It's, skip it.
But when you say you write anything, is it true you would even type out the label on a jam jar?
Yes. Yeah.
So tell us here what that looks like. When you're sitting down at your desk, you walk in, you boot up the computer.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Do you mean when I'm blocked, or?
Just the day begins for you, and you don't know what you're going to write.
I just start typing, man. I don't care. Do you know what I mean? It's like I don't have the reader in mind at all when I'm in the early drafts. I'm just trying to entertain or interest myself. If I can't think of anything, then I'll start typing anything. Literally, there's a jelly jar there. I'll start typing the label of the jelly jar. Or
what happens when you do that?
Well, I think it's a muscle thing. It gets your hands moving. You don't feel locked and blocked. You're not panicking. You're doing something, and then eventually some sort of sentence is going to come out of that. I also, listen, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, as we get a little older, a little more experienced, you get the sense that if things go badly on Tuesday, they're probably going to go okay on Wednesday. That you don't get that feeling of, oh my God, this is the bucket hitting the bottom of the well and hearing just a scraping sound. You get a little older and it's going to be okay.
You're prolific, obviously, 26 novels over a career. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I see it as divided into threes. The Neil Carey period, maybe we can kind of tell, we'll talk about him in a moment. And then surfing is a big part of some of your novels, and PI work. And then we come to this epic Tolstoyan kind of sweep of the Cartel trilogy, which is amazing.
Thank you.
And then in the middle of that, though, there's this book about the NYPD, The Force, which in itself is a masterwork of empathy and reporting. I mean, it's just, and you're doing, I'm imagining that all these investigative skills that you've developed as a PI are helping you as a writer.
Definitely.
And then we come to the Danny Ryan trilogy, which you've said is ending your publishing career, not your writing career necessarily. Just to tighten that up, take us from who is Neil Carey, and then who is Art Keller and Danny Ryan, and who was Don Winslow when he was writing Neil Carey, and who is Don Winslow when he's Danny Ryan? Because if you haven't read any of these books or all of them, start with Cool Breeze from the Underground, the first book of 1991. He's flippant, he's funny. I mean, take it from there. He's a different guy.
It's funny, one time we were doing a reading and my wife was in the house and someone in the Q&A said, "Are you Neil Carey?" And I was shaking my head and from the corner of my eye I could see my wife doing this. Neil Carey was a graduate student in English Lit who kept trying to get his degree, but he also worked for a detective agency that kept sending him on missions where he couldn't get his degree. That was me. I was trying to I have a master's degree in military history, but it kept getting interrupted because I needed to work, and part of the work that I did was finding runaways.
Finding what?
Runaways.
Really?
Yeah.
In your life, this is your real job.
My real job. Yeah. And so a Cool Breeze in the Underground, I was in London looking for somebody. The hottest summer in English recorded history, I was standing in the Tottenham Square tube stop. And for some reason, inexplicable to me even now, a cool breeze came up the subway tunnel. And I had this phrase in my head for years, a cool breeze on the underground. So that day in Africa that we've discussed, when I started to write, I wrote down that phrase. And then I had to ask myself, who's there? Who was experiencing this cool breeze and why? And who is this guy? And then I invented Neil.
Interesting. What is it about crime genre, which is, as you say, is your beloved genre?
Beloved genre.
Why?
A number of reasons. First of all, I think it deals with humanity in extremis in many cases. It's about death and life and murder and lust and greed and honor and dishonor and love. Again, on the edges. My beloved noir, subgenre is always about man versus the machine at its very best. It's about those people on the outskirts, do you know what I mean, struggling. I think that for me, the central question of crime fiction is how do you live decently in an indecent world? I think that most of my characters and most of the characters, certainly in noir, are trying to figure that out. The other aspect, though, is the language is just so beautiful. You just fall in love with it. Do you
have a favorite passage of a noir?
Oh, Raymond Chandler, the opening passage of The Long Goodbye.
Do you know it?
Yeah. The first time I saw Terry, he was drunk, leaning against the silver Wraith Rolls Royce. I got to go to Chandler's house, which was like going to church. And the people who owned the house were unaware of Raymond Chandler. They
Really?
just bought the place.
What was it about the house that was like church?
Because it was where The Long Goodbye was written.
Okay.
Right. It was The Big Sleep, all of those great, beautifully poetic books.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was a street rat, which was tough work, I was reading Elmore Leonard, the irreplaceable Elmore Leonard. Such a hero of mine, and again the language, the dialogue, the humor interspersed with the serious bits, just flipping just like that. It was so skillful, and then Lawrence Block. He has a series about a detective named Matt Scudder working in Hell's Kitchen, where I was working. Right, I'd go to Hell's Kitchen to the Port Authority building, the bus station in Midtown Manhattan, to try to get to Runaways before the pimps did, or sometimes after the pimps did, And so in ways it was talking to me about my own life, but in this, again, I'm being redundant, but beautifully poetic language.
Are you making the argument that somehow crime fiction speaks to us as an American story?
Certainly.
I mean, there's always that tussle between the, quote, literary fiction writers and the crime writers.
Yeah.
I think when I was speaking with Lee Child, he said, the literary fiction writers are the barnacle on the bottom of the boat.
That sounds like Lee.
Yeah, which we genre writers keep afloat.
Well, to a great extent, it's a great line, and Lee's a great guy.
Yeah.
I love Lee. We do keep the publishing industry alive. Between us and the romance writers, if you go into a bookstore, right, we do keep them alive. I was asked one time by a French journalist in not a terribly friendly tone, which shocks you, I know. I won't do the French imitation, don't worry. But he said, do you think that as a crime fiction writer you live in a literary ghetto?
Wow.
And I said, yes, I do. And I love my neighborhood.
Wow. But why do we have this disagreement about, what is it? Because we've had some wonderfully, quote, literary fiction writers here.
Well, we were talking about Jim Harrison earlier.
Yeah, Jim Harrison.
America's greatest writer ever.
You said that recently.
Yeah.
You said he was more important than Hemingway.
Absolutely.
And caused a stir.
Caused a stir.
Yeah.
But I'm right.
Yeah. The prose in those writers is terrific. The prose in your books is terrific. I'm just curious. What I always am wondering about when we talk like this is, what is the story that we're collectively trying to tell?
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
If you could look down from 30,000 feet, right now, writers are kind of the sketch on the graph paper, right?
Okay.
And I think you said, well, I would think it would be anxiety right now. Now that you also find in the best of the literary, quote, literary writers.
Sure.
So I just am wondering, have you ever thought about writing a book like Richard Russo? I know is another hero.
Another hero of mine, yeah. A better writer than Fitzgerald.
Would you know how to write a novel that didn't have crime as an element in it?
I don't think I would.
That's interesting.
I don't think I would. I don't think I'd want to either.
Why not? Right.
This is where I live, right? This is where I grew up. This is where I live. These are the people that I love, and I'm very happy there. I kind of like that we're looked down on. I do. I think it gives us this kind of very useful chip on the shoulder. But then again, that's the way I grew up, right? in a place that was stuck between Boston, highly intellectual Boston looking down on everybody, and New York on the other side, right? And here's Rhode Island growing up in a fishing village where, let's say, the expectations of you were not high, right? And you were told all your life you were mediocre, right?
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
From who? From
teachers.
What would they say?
Other people. Oh, you better have a backup plan.
To
writing.
Okay.
See, when I was quite young when I sort of announced that's what I'm going to do.
Were you 6?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote my first magnus opus at age 6, Doug. Texas John Slaughter and Daniel Boone go west to find more elbow room.
Is that on Kindle?
No. It was actually a play, and my neighbor kid, slightly older than me, Joey Palumbo, used to commission people to write plays, rehearse them, sell the tickets for $0.25, cancel the play, and keep the money.
It's just like the Danny Ryan story.
It was great training for Hollywood, you know.
Criminals.
Criminals. Yeah. No, literally criminals. Yeah.
No, his name was what? Paul Palumbo? No.
Joey Palumbo.
So you have Chris Palumbo.
I do.
In the City in Ruins.
Yeah. There's only so many names, Doug. You know?
Who is Danny Ryan who is Danny Ryan's namesake? Anyone? Or you just like the name?
No, I made Danny up. But having said that, look, I knew dozens of Dannys growing up. You know, I played pond hockey with them. We surfed together, go to bars, you know, cause trouble, all kinds of stuff.
Can you surf in Providence? Excuse me for
surf
asking.
in Rhode Island, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Not in Providence. There's no ocean in Providence.
Yeah.
Saving a hurricane, and then there is. But no, down on the south coast of Rhode Island, which I know sounds silly. It's a tiny state. No, it's decent surfing. It's not Cali. It's not California.
So, Danny Ryan. I want to ask a question about Neil Carey and Danny Ryan.
Okay.
Is there a myth that goes with Neil Carey in the way that Danny Ryan has this antecedent?
No.
No.
I mean, Danny's very much based on Aeneas.
Okay.
Although I wanted like fully modern characters that you could read with no reference to the classics
and you can,
at all.
by the way, all of you who haven't read this book yet, you don't need to know any of this.
No,
but
you don't.
But I want to ask you why you went to this. It's not a device by any means, but you were looking for counterparts. So Helen of Troy is the woman who walks out of the sea at the beginning of City on Fire.
Yeah.
Madeline, Danny's mother, is Aphrodite.
Yeah.
And Pascal Fari is Apollo.
Yeah.
So you have all these. So you have this built-in story.
Yeah.
Why was that appealing to you at this point in your career? You know, to use this as a backdrop.
Well, I started it 30 years ago. Okay, when my career was at one of its many low points. And I don't know, I thought, we haven't invented anything, right? I think by the time the Greeks and Romans finished, all those themes that we deal with in my beloved crime fiction genre have been done. I looked at Aeschylus's the Oresteia, these 3 Greek tragic dramas. Look at the plot. Guy comes home from the war, his wife blames him for their daughter's death. She has a lover, she and the lover kill him.
In a bathtub.
In the bathtub, drown him in the bathtub. His son comes home, realizes what's happened, murders his mother and the lover. He flees, and 3 women, the Furies, relentlessly track him down and bring him back to trial in Athens. By the way, the first trial scene in Western Lit. Put that in black and white and put a trumpet behind it, that's a noir plot.
It is.
It is.
And it is, by the way, for all of you who haven't read it, it's a major storyline in City in Ruins.
In City in Ruins. So I got excited reading those stories, reading the Iliad, reading the Odyssey, reading the Aeneid. And by the way, I took semester-long college courses online in each of them.
Really?
As part of the research, yeah.
What was that like?
Great.
You logged in and...
Yeah, I logged in. There's these programs that you can sign up and you get these great college lecturers, real legit college courses, because I wanted to get as deep as I could, in the background of these stories. Like, who was Helen of Troy before she was Helen? There's a whole story there. Teenage pregnancy, by the way.
She's pregnant, or she is?
Helen was impregnated by a lover when she was 15 or 16 years old, and then moves on in life to become the queen in Helen of Troy. What happens to her afterwards? Or Cassandra, who I very cleverly changed her name to Cassie,
in City Ruins.
Truly creative moment. She had the gift of prophecy, which was a dubious gift because what came with the gift was no one would ever believe her. How did she get that gift? What was she like as a child? Well, there's a real story there. And what happened to her afterwards, after the Trojan War? Another real story there, that I found very exciting and very compelling. And so I just felt this drive, Doug, to tell these stories within the crime genre to the best I could, but I mostly failed at it for 30 years.
You started this in 28 years ago?
Yeah.
30 years ago.
30 years ago
Do you
now.
remember the first sentence you wrote?
Yes.
What is it?
Well, Danny looks at the woman coming out of the ocean.
Oh, that's right.
It hasn't changed.
And trouble is most...
And he knew she was going to be trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Which is Helen of Troy.
Helen of Troy. Very noir kind of line. You should
It is.
say it like Jack Nicholson,
Yeah.
Danny saw a woman coming out of the ocean and knew she was going to be trouble.
Thank you very much. Wow. That had to be very exciting to come across this skein of stories.
Yeah.
And conflicts.
Listen, I read Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses, every other year.
No, you don't.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
No, I do. I've never read Finnegan's Wake, but no one has. But
every other, because it takes you a year and a half to read it, and then you start over again.
No. Because I love it so much.
Really?
Yeah. But, that's where I got the idea. The idea's not that original. There was a great cult film called The Warriors that was based on Xenophon's March of the 10,000.
Is that a Coppola?
No, I forget the director. But, cult movie about New York subway. There's all kinds of examples, and I often say, and it's true, Godfather is a retelling of Shakespeare's Henry IV. Exact same storyline. Diane Falstaff's Diane Keaton, bit of an odd Falstaff, but that's the role that she occupies in that scheme. So it's not like I had this blazingly original idea, nor am I comparing myself to James Joyce in any way, shape, or form. But the idea of creating a trilogy that would go over years and create this modern world out of the ancient world was just compelling to me. But I kept putting it down because I kept failing at it, but then I kept picking it back up again.
You said you didn't feel maybe that you had enough talent when you started. What happened? How did you find you get older?
Yeah. A couple of things happened. Again, I'd pick it up, and I was doing other books, right? It's not like...
Yes, you were.
Yeah, I was doing that whole drug trilogy and, all of that. I think what allowed me to finally finish this, and I can't quite explain it to myself why this is I started to go back, my wife and I started to go back to Rhode Island for longer and longer periods of time to take care of my mother, who, increasingly, we've all been through this, increasingly needed that kind of help. And I fell in love with the place again. I left when I was 17 because there was nothing there for me.
So you went to Nebraska.
Went to Nebraska. Well, the way it was put to me was, we want you to go someplace you can't come home on weekends.
So you can go home again.
You can.
And you did.
I did. And, it's funny, I compare it to, when I went to California, I really reinvented myself as a writer in many ways. And I'm still, every time I drive the Pacific Coast Highway in Southern California, I'm excited. And I've done it now 1,000 times. Every time I'm stoked, right? I started to feel that way about little places in Rhode Island. Now, every time I drive down Matunic Beach Road, I'm excited. I'm in love, right? And then I began to see the people again differently than I think I could have seen them as a teenager. I didn't have that perspective. I think that this might be my most compassionate book.
That's funny. I was going to say, there is a certain amount of joy in this trilogy, a lot of tragedy, but there's a certain amount of compassion, empathy, and tenderheartedness in it. And Danny Ryan, to me, my perception is Danny Ryan is trying to come home.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So it was a homecoming for me, and homecomings are complicated. Particularly when you didn't leave home under particularly happy circumstances.
It wasn't happy when you left at 17?
No. I was glad to get out. I was glad to go.
Were you having tension with your father because...
Tension with the family, tension with the town. I think, it was that era. It was 1971.
So those people you stiffed on the theater thing, they're not having a play.
They're coming after me, yeah. Yeah, it was that era when I think a lot of us were sort of prematurely cynical. I always thought of the Bobby Kennedy assassination as childhood's end for me. We were all looking at going to Vietnam. I was drafted.
You were?
I was.
Late.
Huh?
What year was Kennedy? 68?
68, and I was drafted in 71.
Right.
But I'd recently torn out my knee playing hockey, so they didn't take me. They said, well, wait a year, and then the draft ended. But I was going to go, except my old man, my dad, the Guadalcanal veteran, was against it. And do you have a second? He told me this story. I mean, he said, well, you're not going to, they won't take you because the Navy has you officially as disabled. My mom's looking at him and I'm looking at him. This is the night before the draft physical. What are you talking about? And he said, well, when you were 3 or 4 years old, you were falling down a lot. And he was a medic, and so he took me to one of the Navy doctors, and they said, well, he has 2 extra bones in his back, and he'll probably be able to walk, but he'll never play sports, he'll never do anything. He said, I never told you and I never told your mother, because I didn't want you growing up being afraid of doing these things. So I grew up thinking, yeah, when you play hockey, your back hurts.
Oh.
When you surf, your back hurts. That's just it. And I walk like a broken duck. This foot sort of naturally sticks out that way. So he said, if they're going to take you, I'm going to pull up these records.
Wow.
And this was, the career Marine Guadalcanal guy, right? So, I was gobsmacked. So, but coming home then, many years later, in again sort of bittersweet circumstance. My dad had passed away. My mom was declining, mentally and in every other way. But I just began to see it in a different way and see the people there in a different way. And I think that's what kind of allowed me to I think I had to come to grips with my past before I could come to grips with Danny's.
Do you always think you were headed back home?
No.
No, really?
No, really. No, really.
Well, because there's so much, fate plays such a huge role in these myths.
Yeah.
Character is fate.
Sure.
And so I was just wondering if, in fact...
Yeah. No, I was really surprised. And now we live there half the year.
Right.
We live there summers and fall, and in Cali the rest of the time, So I think, and also, but I think, listen, hopefully we get better at our job, right? And more skilled. And I think that I felt that way about The Force too. I never felt that I had the talent to write that book until I did. You know, I think finally I developed the talent to deal with these ancient themes and to create the characters and create the incidents and things. So.
Yeah, loyalty is a huge thing for Danny Ryan. I think a huge thing for you growing up.
Yeah.
And your family.
Yeah.
I have a question about The Force. How did you get inside that world? How did you write a book that is both damning and celebratory at the same time? It doesn't pull any punches. No. But you begin to feel for these cops who are out on the razor's edge.
Yeah.
How did you do that?
Well, years. I mean, it took me years to develop the relationships. We talked about this earlier. The police force, the NYPD, was harder to penetrate than the drug cartel.
Yeah.
It was a much bigger, thicker wall. The difference was that once you pierced that wall, you were completely in. Right?
Yeah.
Unlike the drug stuff, which was always sketchy and people lying and, you know. But once the NYPD let me in, they let me in. And I was, you know, and I was very open with them about what I was doing. I'm writing a book about dirty cops.
Why did you want to be in? To write the book about dirty cops, or just, I mean, what was it about?
Yeah, I always wanted to write a big New York novel, and when you write about New York, it's a home run or it's a strikeout. There's no singles, there's no bunts, there's no nothing to torture that metaphor. You're either going to fail big or succeed. You know, I'd been influenced as a kid more by film about New York. You know. I mean, the French Connection changed my life. That is one reason I'm a crime writer. When I saw that film as a kid, I went, oh my God, if I could tell stories like that.
What was it? I mean, if you could...
It was so exciting. It was so gritty.
Yeah.
It was so real. It was funny. Years later, I got to talk to you know, Friedkin, you know, which was a big thrill for me, you know. Serpico.
Yeah.
Another film that I absolutely loved. And then a film called Prince of the City about dirty cops.
Mm-hmm.
And the actual cop that was about, Bob Lucy, was a friend of mine. You know, and I knew Bob, and I talked to Bob about his life and what had happened. So the way I view my job is that my job is to bring the reader into a world that she or he otherwise couldn't enter, or maybe if they can, help them see it differently. Mm-hmm. And the way I do that, I think there are a lot of ways of doing that, but my method is almost like a method actor. Mm-hmm. Is to try to get inside the characters and then let you see it through their point of view, through their eyes. Some of those perspectives we might detest, others we might sympathize with, but I'm not making moral judgments. I'm not trying to be objective. I'm trying to be subjective. Let me introduce you through this guy's experience and his thoughts.
You're not interested in self-expression.
Not at all.
What does that mean?
I'm not interesting. I think what's interesting... No, truly, I mean, you know...
They would disagree.
Well, but I mean, a dirty NYPD cop in one of those units is interesting. And I think it also says something about culture and society, and masculinity, and America. Mm-hmm. You know, in the same way that the cartel books said those things. That, to me, is interesting. Mm-hmm. Those worlds, those subcultures are interesting. Who cares if I'm expressing myself? Mm-hmm. Boring.
Do you keep a diary?
No.
No.
Why would I? I already know everything that's in there. You know, I'd like to read other people's diaries, maybe, but
it's a way where you're talking about this cop, that they become a creature from mythology.
Yeah.
Where they're torn between two worlds.
Yeah.
They have a loyalty here and a loyalty there.
Yeah.
That they can't escape their fate.
Right.
Almost if you become the cop, at some point you're going to maybe cross the line. right?
Oh, absolutely.
So maybe that's why it's interesting to you.
Oh, I think so. And what's interesting to me is, like, we can talk about police corruption, right? We can talk about simplistic corruption, like you take money or you don't take money. Kind of interesting. What's more interesting, though, is, I interviewed a cop. He had been retired for 20 years, murder cop, who told a story, and I very rarely bring my wife with me, but I could on this. Guy didn't look at me for 2 hours, right? We're in a bar in Staten Island. He stared at my wife for 2 hours. I'm sitting on the side here. He's looking at her like this. Talking about going into an apartment in Greenwich Village where he knew he should arrest the guy, didn't have grounds to arrest him, but there's lots of ways of getting that done dishonestly, breaking the rules. I mean, for instance, like sometimes the cop might want to go into a house because he knows something bad's happening there. So one cop will stand at the door, and the other cop will run around to the back of the house and yell, "Help." And that allows the cop at the front of the door to go in because he can testify he heard someone yelling, "Help."
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Very common thing to do. This guy didn't do it. 2 weeks later, he goes back, and the guy had murdered his infant. This cop is telling the story to my wife with tears streaming down his face, and it's 20 years after the event. So it's kind of easy to look at corruption in a very simplistic way. But I know people who've regretted the rest of their lives not being corrupt at certain moments.
And he's talking to your wife because maybe he can't face you.
Can't face me because it's a woman there. Right? He didn't like me, man. When I showed up, and he only talked to me because another cop. It's that network.
Right.
Right. And you've experienced this. It said, "Hey, would you talk to Winslow?" Yeah, okay, because you asked.
Were you recording this or taking notes?
Never record, never take notes.
How do you record it? How do you?
Memory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you get up from the interview and walk into the restroom and take notes?
No. When I go home, at the end of the day, then I'll make notes. But no, God, sitting with some drug dealer, and show up with a tape recorder or a notebook. Hi. Hi, Luis. But it's worse with cops. You know this, right?
And they shut up, yeah.
They clam right up, There's I think a 38-page segment in that book that's just cops telling stories.
In what book?
The Force, where 5 cops are sitting down at dinner and they just start telling this young cop stories.
Oh, right. They're inducting him into
Yeah. And the editor kept taking it out. And stop moving the action forward, and I kept putting it back in and taking it out, putting it back in, and I finally said, no, it's staying in because A, they're great stories and they're all true, and B, it's going to bring the reader close to these guys. I don't care that there's nothing happening. Right? Physically, something's happening mentally, something's happening emotionally, and plus, 3 of the 4 stories are just really funny.
Right. What do we learn by reading these kinds of books? They're appealing. You're a best-selling author around the world. Mm-hmm. You're doing very well. Why do people come to them, do you think?
I really wish I knew the answer to that. I know what I'm trying to do. In some cases. Some books I write just for entertainment. Just for fun, laughs,
that you've written?
Action. Yeah.
Give me.
Well, like that short story, The San Diego Zoo, about a monkey that finds a revolver.
That's in the book Broken, by the way.
It is, yeah.
And it's 6 books.
6 novellas, yeah.
6 novellas in one book.
In one book.
It's quite a deal.
Yeah, it was fun. There's just ideas that I had that didn't have the weight of a novel, and I just sat down and typed, So sometimes I'm writing just for that. But in a book, for instance, like The Border, right? See, I think, and no offense to you, that sometimes novelists can do things that journalists can't,
Right.
or probably shouldn't. I mean, you get very close to your characters. I've always, when I read your books, I feel very close to those people. I think you
thank
do
you.
a fantastic damn job of that while respecting the strictures of nonfiction. Wonderful. But we both know that headlines become cliches, become stereotypes, right? So when I was writing, for instance, The Border, immigration was a big thing, and then it was illegal immigration, and that becomes a stereotype. What a novelist can do, and what you do in your books, though, as well, if I can get a reader to spend weeks, days with a 10-year-old boy coming up from Guatemala on that train, they're never going to see that issue as a stereotype. They see it in a deeper way. At the time I was writing that book, the opioid crisis had hit, you know. Again, it's one thing to talk about a heroin addict, but it's another thing if the reader spends days and weeks with a young woman addicted to heroin, they're never going to see it in the same way again. They have to see it in a deeper kind of a way. So again, what I'm trying to do is bring the reader into those worlds. Here's what this is like.
Right.
Here's what this is like on a daily basis. Here's what it's like on a granular kind of level.
It's interesting, you're writing about news that's in the headlines.
Yeah.
In a fictive sense.
Sure.
Did writing The Border, the Cartel trilogy, there's Power of the Dog, the Cartel, and then The Border.
The Border.
And The Border brings it back to the U.S.
Yes.
Did writing those books change you? Which had the most impact on you as on your soul?
The Cartel.
And how come?
Well, both the Cartel and The Border, I guess. It was so brutal. You know, I did Dog, Power of the Dog, and I swore I would never go back to that world because it had been so violent and so brutal, and there are a couple of scenes in that book I still wonder if I should have written.
True scenes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, every violent incident in any of those three books actually happened. There's one or two that still trouble me.
Because they're too graphic?
Too graphic, too brutal, too sad. Listen, there were things I didn't write because they were too horrible.
Yeah.
But there's a scene in particular in Dog that I still wonder, should I have done that? Cartel, by far. You know, I came back because I thought that I could explain to American and European audiences what was really happening in Mexico. And again, in a fictive way. Other people have done great jobs of it in nonfiction. Anya Hernandez in Mexico and other people. So I wrote the damn book, which was another 3 years. Dog was 6.
You started The Dog in 98.
Yeah.
Sitting at the breakfast table reading a news story, if I remember.
About the massacre of 19 innocent men, women, and children. And wondering how could that happen. Now, mind you, by the time we got to the era that the Cartel covers, 19 murders doesn't make the papers.
Right.
That's a low body count for that day. If you're looking at Juarez in 2006, 2007.
It's interesting. I was looking at that year, 1998. That's the year Google is founded.
Yeah.
Viagra is introduced to the market. Titanic wins the Academy Award.
Okay.
Clinton's impeached.
Yep.
And you're sitting at your breakfast table reading this news article.
Yeah.
And you stick to this Cartel story.
Yeah.
Which somehow you're way ahead of the times. You begin to pick out this story that's going to dominate the next 2 decades of American life in a way.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah, listen.
You know why that happened to you?
I do. I started to research it not because I wanted to write a book, right? I had no interest in drugs at all. You know, I've been around them too much in my life. You know,
back in Rhode Island.
Yeah, kids shooting heroin in the men's room.
In high school?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Really? Wow. I'm not going to argue.
You say so, Doug.
Wow. Okay.
And then I lived in New York, as a teenager, and because I was still working as an actor in a neighborhood known as Needle Park. right? So I didn't want anything to do with that world because I knew it too damn well, and I didn't like it, hated it. But I was trying to discover for my own self how anything could come to the point where people would do that.
Kill each other en masse.
19, dragging, and this is really bringing this evening down, and I apologize, but so I started reading philosophy books, which if anyone who knows me would be shocked, because I'm an extraordinarily shallow human being, you know, and I'm reading, you know, books like What is Evil and the Problem of Evil, but
Really?
the answers were not there. And so I started to read the history of Mexico and Central America, and I started to read more and more about the drug trade and America's role in it, and the more I read, the angrier I got, and then one morning I just started typing, you know, and then 6 years later, you know, Power of the Dog comes out, sells nothing in America.
It doesn't. I didn't know that.
After Dog, I had $37 in the bank.
No, really?
Yeah, I was standing in the driveway wondering how to buy groceries, you know.
You spent 6 years on this book.
Yeah, which is a long time not to bring a book out. Right, the savings just... but Cartel was such a more brutal era. You talk about the internet. You know, when I was writing Dog, the cartels were trying to hide their atrocities. By the time of the cartel, they were proclaiming them on the internet as a recruitment and intimidation tactic. Everything that ISIS later did, they got from the Mexican cartels in terms of, you know, the intimidation on the internet. So that book,
The cartel book
had its effect.
And it was more successful than the...
It was phenomenally more successful. It was sort of the breakout for me, but it took its toll.
How did you recover?
Well, again, I quit. Right, I said I'm never going back to that world. I wrote some lighter surfer books, you know,
Like,
Dawn Patrol, Gentleman's Hour. You know, I went back to the ocean.
okay.
But you know, again at the time, you know, I'm a husband and a father.
Okay.
Right? So you can't check out, right? There's no such thing.
Right.
And so I remember in researching and writing that book, leaving my office at the end of a day and then trying to come back and be, you know, Don and be daddy, having spent the day watching atrocity videos. You've seen them. Or, you know, looking at autopsy photos, or, you know, you'd get the call from the mother of a heroin addict who just overdosed and died. So those were difficult years.
Did you find any successful strategy to the reentry problem, you know?
On the daily reentry, I would cook dinner.
Okay.
So try to do something normal and mundane, and, you know, I became the family cook. You know, I'd put music on and I'd make dinner, and, you know, we'd do normal family kinds of stuff, you know.
Wow. Finding the Ryan trilogy must have been a relief in a way.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
Wow.
You know, because I could go back to this mythological world.
That made sense in a way.
I guess now that we talk about it, it does. I hadn't thought of it in that way before, to tell you the truth.
I mean, the cartel world is utter chaos. There's no organizing principle.
None.
But there is the mythology.
Yeah,
There's Apollo.
Yeah, there's Apollo, and there's Aphrodite, and,
right.
You know, and there was this sort of, you know, these legends that you could follow and get deeply into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, would you read to us? I know the audience is dying to ask some questions.
Okay.
And would you read, though, a section from City in Ruins?
Sure, if you'd like.
And then once we do that, we'll bring up the lights and we'll talk.
All right. Is that okay with you all? Need these now to do it. Sort of getting older is the dumbest thing we do. I'm giving it up. You watch. Sorry, it takes me a second here. Danny's discontent. Looking down at the Las Vegas Strip from his office window, he wonders why. Less than 10 years ago, he thinks, he was fleeing Rhode Island in an old car with an infant son, a senile father, and everything he owned jammed in the back. Now he's a partner in 2 hotels on the Strip, lives in a freaking mansion, owns a cabin up in Utah, and drives a new car every year that the company pays for. Danny Ryan is a multi-millionaire, which he finds as amusing as it is surreal. He never dreamed, hell, nobody who knew him back in the day ever dreamed that he'd ever have a net worth beyond his next paycheck, much less be considered a mogul, a major power player in the major power game that is Las Vegas. Whoever doesn't believe that life is funny, Danny thinks, doesn't get the joke. He can easily remember when he had $20 in his jeans pocket and he thought he was rich. Now the clip he keeps in one of his tailor-made suits usually has 1,000 or more in it as walking around money. Danny can recall when it was a big deal when he and Terry could afford to go out for Chinese on a Friday night. Now he dines at Michelin star restaurants more than he wants to, which partially accounts for the shelf developing at his waistline. But he still prefers a cheeseburger to Kobe beef, good fish and chips, impossible to get in Vegas at any price, to Chilean sea bass. And on the rare occasion when he has to fly anywhere, he goes commercial instead of taking the corporate jet. He does, however, fly first class. His reluctance to use the company's Learjet pisses his son off no end. Danny gets it. What 10-year-old doesn't want to fly in a private jet? Danny has promised Ian that the next vacation they go on of any distance, they'll do it. But he'll feel guilty about it. Dan is a chowderhead, his partner Dom Rinaldi said one time, meaning that he's an old New England, practical, cheap guy for whom any kind of physical indulgence is deeply suspect. Danny deflected the issue. Try getting a decent bowl of chowder here, not that milky baby puke they serve, but real chowder in the clear broth. You employ 5 executive chefs, Dom said. They'll make you chowder from virgin Peruvian frogs if you tell them to. Sure, but Danny won't do that. He wants his chefs spending their time making the guests anything they want. That's where the money comes from. He gets up, stands by the window, tinted to combat the relentless Las Vegas sun, and looks down at the Lavinia Hotel. The old Lavinia, Danny thinks, the last of the hotels from the 50s building boom. A relic, a remnant barely hanging on. Its long-gone heyday was the era of the Rat Pack, wise guys and showgirls, counting rooms, skim, and dirty money. If those walls could talk, Danny thinks, they'd take the 5th. But you've changed, he thinks. It's not just the excess pounds, the slick-back Pat O'Reilly haircut, the suits from Brioni instead of Sears, cufflinks instead of buttons. Before Las Vegas, you wore suits only at weddings and funerals. Given the hard facts about New England in those days, there were more of the latter than the former. It's not just that you have folding money in your pocket, that you can pay for a meal without worrying about the tab, or that a tailor will come to your office with a tape measure and swatches. It's the fact that you like it. But there's this sense of discontent. Why, he wonders. You have more money than you can spend. Is it just greed? Danny knows himself. With all his faults, his sins, and they are legion, greed isn't one of them. He used to joke with Terry that he could live in his car, and she'd retort, have a good time. So what is it? What do you want? Permanence? Stability? Things you've never had, but you have them now. He thinks of the beautiful hotel he built, the shores. Maybe it's beauty you want, some beauty in this life, because you've sure as hell had the ugly. A wife dead from cancer, a child left without a mother, friends killed, and the people you killed. But you did it. You built something beautiful. So it's more than that, Danny thinks. Be honest with yourself. You want more money because money is power and power is safety. And you can never be safe enough. Not in this world. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. You're a wonderful reader, Don. We're going to bring the lights up, and if you have a question, I believe we have some we have them right here in the aisle.
Okay.
Come forward and ask. Would you mind? Yeah.
That was a great interview. Thank you. Oh, yeah, appreciate it. Hi.
I'm Austin.
Hi, Austin.
Hey, Austin.
That was an awesome conversation you guys just had. So it was billed to us as a retirement tour, and I'm extremely curious about this retirement. Like, what are you going to do? What are your readers going to do? And it seems like your final novel came out, so you might already be retired. So maybe what are you already doing? If you could talk about that a little bit, I'd be wildly interested.
Yeah, a little bit.
Thanks.
As to what I'm going to do, I kind of don't know yet, because I'm not retired at the moment. I'm here. As to what my readers are going to do, I hope they go back to some of my old books and think fondly of me, please. That would be nice. But the last 5 or 6 years, I've been pretty politically engaged on social media, and I don't want to make this a political evening because it's not. But at least into the first week or so of November, be pretty engaged on social media and creating some videos that we've been doing for a while that have had over 300 million views, by the way. And I'll be doing that. Thank you.
Okay. Someone else.
Thanks for the question.
Well,
There's a lady right there. Uh-oh. Well, thank you very much.
Would you mind just going to the microphone and I'm sorry.
That's all right. Troublemaker.
I came here from Wisconsin to see
Okay.
you. I've been reading you for a year. And
All
I've
right.
read a
If you
lot
could
of
step
your
closer
books.
to the microphone.
And I've
Speak into the
read
microphone, then.
a lot of your books. And, with like The Border, The Cartel, Power of the Dog, I find that I'm writing like all these tiny little notes to keep track of all the people.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody else does that or
Yes,
I just
people have
do that.
reported that to me, yes.
Okay. The other thing is The Kings of Coal.
Yes.
This thing, when Ben asks his dad what happened, that has been so moving to me growing up in the 60s. And the
you.
way that you categorize and historically document all of those events from the 60s and, probably 70s too, were just, it was brilliant to me. I'm in a local book club. I read part of that. I've gotten people into your books.
Thank you.
And I am just a huge fan.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming from Wisconsin.
I really loved writing that book, which is set in Laguna Beach in the 60s and 70s, because it allowed me to get into social history that I was fascinated by. That's a true story. People wanted to start a bookstore, and they didn't have the money, and they bumped into a surfer at the Taco Bell on Brook Street, where I often surf. And the surfer said, "Oh, I know how to get money. We take a van down to Mexico, fill it full of marijuana, and come back." And that's literally a true story, and that bookstore was there until quite recently. And so when the surfers met the hippies in Laguna Beach in that year in the 60s, started this whole kind of different culture, which fascinated me. But that was a very kind comment, and thank you. I'm glad you liked it.
I have a question, Don, while someone else gathers the courage here. Do you read your stuff aloud when you're writing?
Yes.
I
I read the dialogue aloud when I'm writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With a pencil? Or you're changing as you go?
Changing as I go. You probably experience this as well. I won't hear the right notes I'll sure as hell hear the wrong notes.
Yeah.
They just clang, you know?
Right.
And then I can fix it. And then usually mid to late morning, I'm either out in the ocean if we're in Rhode Island, or if we're in California, I go to somewhere about a 4-mile hike. And while I'm hiking, I'm revising dialogue.
Really?
Yeah, I'm speaking it to myself, or those characters. I know this sounds weird, but the characters are speaking to me. And then as they speak, I'm editing and refining and refining and refining, so that when I get back to the desk, I can just type it out.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I walked off a little bluff one time. I missed a curve. So I was so involved in the dialogue. All of a sudden, I'm crashing down this hillside, you know.
Is it true that you finished The Cartel in the morning and started a second book that afternoon?
Yes.
What was that second book?
The Force.
No. Wow.
Well, why waste an afternoon?
That's like finishing Anna Karenina in the morning and then starting War and Peace in the afternoon.
Well, reading them.
Yeah.
No.
Wow.
No, listen, I mean, why, you know, it's 1 in the afternoon. Why? There's no point in stopping.
A professor gave you some very good advice
Yeah.
one day, right?
Pete Maslowski, God bless him, told me never waste 10 minutes. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know how sometimes maybe you're going out with your wife for the evening, you're going somewhere and you have a 10-minute gap. The temptation is to sit there or watch TV or something else. He said, you can do something productive. And I have rewritten sentences in those 10 minutes that have made a big difference.
Yeah. Noelle.
Hi, yes, we have a question from the online audience. Do you have audiobooks, and if so, who narrates them?
I do have audiobooks. All my books are in audio, and various people, depending on the book, narrate them. I do have a series, however, of short stories out now on Audible that Ed Harris narrates, and does them really well. So I'm pleased about that. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more. Go right over here.
Don, I'm really interested. You've had this career that you describe as kind of some ups and downs, and looking back from where you're at now, is there a character, a book, a series, is there anything you look back on and think, wow, that was what really kind of kept that spark going?
Wow. Well, Dog, The Power of the Dog, which, you know, changed my life in a lot of ways, for good and ill, but mostly for good, I would say. The Cartel. And then really finishing this trilogy. You know, I finally thought that maybe I was the writer I set out to be.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, come on, you felt this. You felt these self-doubts. Haven't you? No? Yes, you. You lying sack.
Okay, Don.
Snot.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
Don.
yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
What did that feel like when you said, I feel like the writer I meant to? As we go out here, what does that mean?
One thing it meant was it's time to hang it up. You know, to say, I did what I set out to do. And now it's time to attempt to exit the stage graciously and make space under the lights for younger people. People coming up, you know, who deserve that light and that heat, because there are a lot of good ones, as we know, coming up. So it felt like, yeah, okay, you know, a lot of the world told you for many years you couldn't do this. You told yourself for too many years you couldn't do this.
Couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it. And now you did. So be grateful for that, enjoy that, and set it down.
Thank you, Don Winslow.
Thank
I think
you.
it's a great place in. You've been a real joy to have on stage.
And you.
Yeah. No. Hi, Clark.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming from Wisconsin.
Really, thank you. Wow.
That was a terrific conversation. Thank you both for an amazing evening. Also to Susan Odgers as well. Congrats. Your support helps us with our Raising Writers program as well as Battle of the Books. And if you're looking for something really fun to do next Saturday, go to West High, and you can see the Battle of the Books kicking off. I hope you can join us. We have one more gift for Don from one of our amazing sponsors, Cherry Republic. And if you don't like chocolate-covered cherries, call me.
Thank you, Clark. And we're going to do one thing before you leave. We're going to take a picture. Sean's going to come on stage, and this is a wonderful thing to do. If you would hold the book and face me, and then if you have the book with you, if you would hold it up.
And what am I doing?
You're going to look at him, yeah.
If you can step back towards the edge, careful.
Right after that bluff straw.
This is some sort of really bad trick.
Hold the book really high so we can see it in the photo. Oh, that's great. That's beautiful. All right. Thank you so much. We'll be in the lobby. Don will be signing his books there. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for joining us. Next time, NWS hosts best-selling nonfiction author Hampton Sides, featuring The Wide, Wide Sea. Don't miss your chance to see him live in Traverse City or via livestream. Get in-person or virtual tickets at nationalwriterseries.org. Good night.